guys, this is my capstone project, The Artist Teacher by Jenny Bittner. So this is a statement of the problem. As educated professionals in a variety of visual disciplines, art educators in the K-12 field often spend their time divided between curriculum design, the preparation of room and materials, student assessment, and several other professional roles that are expected of educators each day. Many of these educators fail to maintain their role as a practicing artist throughout their busy teaching schedule. In my own personal practice, the identity of being an artist is what led me into art education, and I often neglect my artistic identity due to the many roles that I have to play as an educator. The significance of the problem. Researchers have found that the identity of the teacher as an artist can be beneficial to the art education process. If the teacher expresses their identity as an artist to their students, not only can their students learn, but they can also develop relationships as they see their instructor's visual journeys manifest. Showing my identity as an artist tends to show as my humanness, which I believe fosters relationships and learning in the culture of my classroom. So these 3 pictures I've put in the slide. The first one is a poster that I did. It was an assignment that I gave to my students. It was based on lyrics that had to do with race. So while I was working on this, my students were also working on theirs. So in the middle, you see one of my students' lyric posters that they created. And I think I got a lot of good feedback as I worked alongside with them, and I will talk about that a little bit more as I go along. And then the last one is me teaching one of my students a woodworking project that we did this year, just sharing one of my passions, which is definitely woodworking, getting them to get their hands on these big tools that they might not necessarily get to ever use in regular day life, and getting to see how they work and kind of empowering them with those tools. So here are my research questions and sub-questions. My research question is, does the teacher's artistic practice affect the artistic practice of students? The sub-questions are, what does the significance of the teacher's role as an artist do in the classroom? And will teacher art making inspire students to further investigate and develop their own artwork? So a quick definition of my terms. One I use a lot in this is the artist teacher, and that is defined as art educators typically use the term to describe their dual practice or to emphasize the importance of art production in relation to their teaching. We use critiques throughout this research and throughout my teaching pedagogy, so that would be dialogues between instructors and students that engage the different perspectives of the instructor, the students whose art is being critiqued, and the student artist's peers. Meaning making, or the purpose or why behind creating a work of art, and we focus definitely on that throughout each of the projects that we make. Art-based research, the investigation through the act of producing, analyzing, or informing through the creation of art. And then ground theory, interpretive qualitative research that is thick in description and is the basis for inductive generation of theory that emerges from the data through rigorous procedures. So going through a little bit of the literature that I looked at into this research, I looked at first and foremost identity. So the article Artists and Art Educators Making Sense of Identity Issues in Art Education magazine discusses that psychologists believe that professional identity builds on personal identity. Redefining the Artist Teacher in Art Education magazine dives into the history of the duality of art teaching and art making, and the identity separation, as artists have always taught their trade, craft, or discipline. However, once the field of art education developed a teacher training course for prospective educators, it provided an opportunity to focus on the craft of teaching. This focus on teaching has created an environment where most K-12 art teachers are not expected to be active artists. The next thing that I looked at in this literature was the influence of identity in the classroom. So how that terminology that we looked at and identity played a role in the classroom. On one level, the desire to be an artist and a teacher may be viewed as a personal matter. However, maintaining both roles has been shown to be a significant indicator of successful art education programs. The notion of artist-teacher is about bringing together studio practices, problems, and art world discussions to improve learning. This improved learning is developed from connections between studio and art classroom and the educator's ability to constantly reinvent what they do and how they do it in the classroom. And then Imes and Rangeltbert find that when teachers embrace this artist-teacher identity, significant benefits emerge for the quality of teaching, partly because artist-teachers then function as role models, partly because they improve their technical skills, and partly because artistic practice brings an improved state of mind and feeling of professional competence. And then the last thing that I looked at was any setbacks or issues that people had with the artist-teacher identity, or that maybe other people had outside of the art education realm, what issues that they faced with that identity that we talked about in the beginning. So when art educators did gain a sense of artistic identity before entering the workforce, many found it difficult to sustain in K-12 schools because of time and energy that teaching requires. This often results in artist teachers becoming convinced that educating students is their sole responsibility at the cost of developing themselves as artists. And without developing artistic practice, many of the art teachers who did not engage in professional arts practice are often portrayed as less successful. So, in my own research design, my data source and instrumentation, I mostly focused in on my high school students, so teaching grades 9 through 12. I have 3 Art 1 classes, which are an introductory level class, and then I have 1 advanced class. So that is anyone who's had that introductory level class, and they can take that advanced class from Art 2 to Art 4. The student contribution that I looked at was from their sketchbooks. I also looked at their critiques, so I had them write down wowies and what ifs. We looked at notes that they took during their critiques and so on. And then I also implement grading rubrics in when they turn an assignment in. So I also look to see how the assignment affected their overall outcome. I reflected on practice, so I took notes each day in a journal, just kind of reflecting on teacher practice, whether I was able to create work with my students during the day, what worked well and what didn't, and I also used that as a lesson plan analysis, so seeing which lessons worked better than others, because I definitely had some that were super successful and got a lot of students engaged, and then I had some that didn't work out as planned. I also did a poll. So I polled other art teachers through Facebook, and I specifically sent it out on the art teacher group and the MU Grad House group. Through the creation of artwork by the teacher, the documentation and investigation of student artwork will be analyzed to determine any effect, inspiration, or developments made due to this modeling method by the educator. So a quick protection of human rights. As students will be photographed and recorded, parents and or guardians of school-age children will be required to fill out a student directory information notification form with the school district if the guardian does not wish for their child to be photographed or video recorded. So unlike in the past where you generally have to get signed permission for them to be recorded, this is kind of the reverse, just a blanketed, if you don't want your kid to be photograph, then they let us know a list of those students who cannot be. Whereas if you didn't sign that paper, then it's pretty much fair game. Then I also had to apply to the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, also known as FERPA. And for full transparency of this research, an informational permission form will be sent home to all guardians whose child is enrolled in art and may have potential involvement in the research study. So I just sent home something that said, this is what I'm working on. Your student will be photographed, but it's only for research purposes only. So a big part of my research collection was through this reflective journal. So I had a couple quotes that I thought were interesting, and most of those were the ones that had to do with things that students said while I was working on work alongside them or in the art room while they were present. So I did include a picture of something that I am working on, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. So on August 22nd, I did work on my Drain the Pen, and all of my high school classes, Art 1 classes, started asking questions about my materials, the length of time I had spent on it, and etc. On September 11th, I worked on my poster, so I showed that example earlier on in the presentation, and that was the poster that I was working on. So during 4th and 7th period today, I had several questions like, what does it say? What is it supposed to be? What songs are you using? And comments like, that's dope, and Miss Benner's killing it, which is always fun to hear. September 25th, I worked on Lisenby's ceiling tile today. I had a couple of inquiries about it. It will be interesting to see if working on something completely different than my students will have an impact. So this is the ceiling tile that I'm working on. We have a teacher who's very into heavy metal, and I've been painting on this during my class whenever I get a chance, but I really kind of wanted to see whether or not I got as many questions about what I was doing if I was doing something completely different than them. So they were actually doing a painting assignment during this, but it was not anything, it wasn't on a ceiling tile, it wasn't the media, we were focused on something completely different. So I was just kind of seeing whether or not they would give me as many questions. Continuing with this reflective journal, so on September 26th, I worked on Lisenby's tile today and mostly received questions about what I was doing. So I didn't get as many in-depth questions, just like, hey, Miss Benner, what are you doing over there? That sort of thing. October 28th, I worked on my paper mache during 3rd period. We were working on paper mache at this point, but couldn't 4th period due to special education student needs. So I had specifically that day had to work with my special ed students. They were struggling just a little bit with the assignment, so I had to give them my full attention. However, during that period when I was working with that student, somebody did look at my personal paper mache and asked if they could make a chin like mine on their masks. So we were making masks. I had that example out for them to see, and somebody did talk to me about how I made mine, if they can make one like that on theirs, etc. October 29th, it was a big help having my mask to use as an example. Didn't get to work on it much. Had someone ask me how I made my eyes look like they did. I explained with tape. So again, having that example, showing them how I was able to make something, showing them how I was able to manipulate the tape to create the eyes, was all a positive feedback. November 20th, I demonstrated relief carving today. They were very quiet and very interested. I used my examples and own artwork to talk about white lines versus black lines, chatter, composition, etc. We reference these a lot in conversation as they grasp what to carve and what not to carve on their linoleum blocks. So my background is in printmaking, so I did have a lot of my own personal work to show during this, and that being said, I was able to show them things like what chatter looks like and talk to them about composition and that white line versus black line, because it can be hard for them to comprehend without seeing those things. And so I did have a couple of the blocks alongside the print so they could kind of see how those things translated from one to the other. So this is looking at the teacher poll. I got 64 total responses. Looking at the grade levels, I had some 25 that taught elementary school, 28 that taught middle school, and 26 that taught high school. So with the total number of responses, that means that multiple teachers teach various grade levels. These teachers have been teaching from a range of 1.5 to 39 years. So I feel like I got a good range of grade levels and a good range of experience in teaching. So looking at some of the responses, one of the questions I asked was, do you consider yourself a practicing artist? A majority of them said yes. And then, do you share your artwork or artistic practice with your students? And I think that kind of reflected with the response. So again, a majority saying yes, they did share it. And I think one thing that might consider for the big difference is that some people might not be actively practicing, but they might have examples from past. So that might be a reason why they could consider themselves like sharing with their practice with their students. So with more teachers sharing their artistic practice or artwork with their students, then considering themselves practicing artists is maybe due to the idea that creating example work or demonstrating a skill would not be considered an artistic practice. That could also be said. So for instance, if I was making a smiley face and that was all I was doing just to show a student how to make a smiling face, I might not consider myself an artist just because I can make a smiling face. If you are a practicing artist teacher, do you find your practice beneficial to your students? So I had some yes, no, maybes on here, and again, the majority saying yes. With only 61 responses to the question, many may have felt that they do not consider what they do as artistic practice. So again, going back to, if they're just doing something as basic as an example, then that might not be necessarily what they want their artistic practice to be. Some respondents reply that they show their work, but they do not work on their portfolio work during class time, or may only discuss their practices. So they might not necessarily show their end product, but they might show how they might get from point A to point B as they're working alongside their students. So a couple comments from the poll that I got, I found these to be pretty helpful, especially when looking at some of the data. I feel like kids take my advice and suggestions more seriously when they see me walking the walk. Going through the artistic process and journey helps me understand what my students are going through, and I also like them to know that I'm serious about my own art making and can relate to and articulate how to overcome creative block, effectively visually communicate, manipulate media, etc. So a bit of the final conclusion in this project, I think that the artistic practice of the teacher is deemed helpful as a teaching tool. The artistic practice of the teacher is used as a means of modeling behaviors, so they can see not only how to do something like an example of their assignment, but they can also see that artists get through blocks or challenges or something that they might have quote-unquote messed up, and how they can fix those things. Using artistic practice in the classroom allows not only for students to see how the teacher works as an artist, but opens up the opportunity for discussion and communication between students and the teacher. So not only did we talk about what we were doing artistically, but with things like the ceiling tile or other artwork that I would bring in, it was able to just kind of open up lines of communication to my students so that we got to know each other a little bit better, and build that relationship and trust, which I think are important in art making. The teacher education process should include the continuation and development of the teacher as an artist. I think that in the education program, at the bachelor's level, as we're training these teachers, I think it's important for them to realize that their artistic practice does not stop when they graduate. It is hounded in them when they're going through that college experience that they have to make because it's a requirement of their other studio classes. But for me personally, I was never given that information that I needed to continue my artistic practice as a teacher, not from my education classes or from my supervising teachers during my student teaching either. Many of them might have been practicing outside of school, but they didn't bring it into their classroom and didn't know how to incorporate those things. And I think it would be interesting knowing that since it is such a helpful tool in teaching, that would become part of teacher education curriculum. And then continuing the practice of artist teacher has the potential to create. So, just continuing to make and develop and take classes, and even my own personal experience, I try to use the summer to take my own personal art classes, and that can develop into more than just me developing myself as an artist. It can also help to develop my classroom. As I learn new techniques, I can actually bring those back into the classroom and teach new skills to my students as I continue to create or even just explore on my own time. I think it's very powerful to the students and to the teacher as well. Alright, well, that's all I got for you guys. I hope that maybe this inspires some educators to get in there and get back into what they love and what they're passionate about, since they did get into teaching because they wanted to share how much they love and felt passion for art. I hope that they can continue to do that through their own practice.